Why should anyone care about a book written 700 years ago in medieval Spain, composed in Aramaic, a language no longer spoken even then by hardly anyone in the world? Why would anyone read a book that's intentionally cryptic and perplexing? Why? Because the Zohar challenges our understanding of God and dares us to transform ourselves. It shatters childish theological images and discovers a God called infinity, Ein Sof. Ein Sof, God as infinity, transcends gender and personality. But in the realm of the Sefirot, the 10 qualities of God that we'll explore a little bit later, in those Sefirot, God is female and male, Shekhinah and the Holy One, blessed be He. Israel's spiritual task is to unite these male and female halves of God through living a holy life. Every human action affects the divine couple, either promoting or hindering their union. God is not static being, but dynamic becoming. The Zohar is a vast commentary on the Torah and the masterpiece of Qabalah. How did it emerge? Let's begin by briefly tracing the roots of Qabalah itself. Qabalah crystallized in Provence and Spain in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the mystical stream within Judaism is certainly much older. For example, I just mentioned Ein Sof, God as infinity. This is certainly one of the key insights of Qabalah, the boundlessness of God and His indefinability. The idea of Ein Sof is dependent on Maimonides' conception of God, but there's an ancient precursor right in the book of Exodus, when Moses learns God's secret name, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, I am who I am, I will be who I will be. It's as if right there in the book of Exodus, God is refusing to define Himself. And in a sense, that lays the groundwork for the later notion in Qabalah of Ein Sof, the infinite. Of the various visions of God in the Bible, the most graphic account is undoubtedly the opening chapter of Ezekiel. Standing by a river in Babylon, the prophet sees a throne whirling through heaven, accompanied by 4 winged creatures darting to and fro. On the throne is, quote, a figure with the appearance of a human being, unquote, surrounded by radiance like a rainbow. Ezekiel experienced that vision near the beginning of the 6th century BCE. Even before his book was canonized in the Bible, his vision had become the archetype of Jewish mystical ascent. Until the emergence of Qabalah in the Middle Ages, Jewish spiritual seekers used Ezekiel's account as their model. It came to be called Maaseh Merkavah, the account of the chariot, God's chariot throne. And that account was studied, expounded, and re-experienced. An entire literature developed, recounting the exploits of those who followed in Ezekiel's footsteps. Among them, some of the leading figures of rabbinic Judaism, such as Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. The mystical journey was arduous and dangerous, requiring intense ascetic preparation, precise knowledge of secret passwords in order to be admitted to the various heavenly palaces, which were guarded by menacing angels. Among the prerequisites were knowledge of Torah, observance of the mitzvot, and ethical purity. The final goal was to attain a vision of that divine figure on the throne. This account over the following centuries developed further, and individuals and small groups pondered those secrets of Ezekiel's vision and developed techniques of meditation, refining their conception of God. As Jews migrated from the Middle East to Europe, these techniques and speculations spread to the West. Certain mystical teachings were referred to as Qabalah, literally that which has been received. The root kabel means to receive, so you could translate Qabalah, receiving, or that which has been received, or tradition, but it was applied specifically to these mystical teachings based on the vision Ezekiel had of the throne. Gradually, the term Qabalah was applied to the entire body of mystical tradition. Toward the end of the 12th century, in the fertile region of Provence, we find an active circle of Kabbalists in the midst of a vibrant Jewish community whose culture encompassed rabbinic law, philosophy, as well as mysticism. From Provence, these teachings spread southward, spilling over the Pyrenees into Spain, and it's here in 13th century Spain that Qabalah crystallizes. Its masterpiece was Sefer HaZohar. What is the Zohar? And let me just make this distinction. There's no book called the Qabalah. Qabalah is really a name for the overall philosophy, the whole movement of Jewish mysticism. The Zohar is the major text of the Qabalah, which first appeared in Spain in the 13th century. The title of the book, Zohar, means radiance. It comes from a verse in the book of Daniel, V'hamaskilim yazhiru kezohar harakia. The enlightened will shine like the Zohar, the radiance of the sky. The Zohar seemed to appear out of nowhere. Around the year 1280, a Spanish Kabbalist named Moisés de Leon began circulating booklets of biblical commentary. These, you could say, were the first installments of the Zohar, written in a lyrical Aramaic, sparkling with invented words, arcane symbolism, and erotic imagery. The tales and teachings were puzzling, yet enchanting. Moisés de Leon claimed that he was merely the scribe, copying from an ancient manuscript. The original had supposedly been composed over 1,100 years earlier in the circle of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a famous disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who lived in the 2nd century in the land of Israel. This Rabbi Akiva, the real historical Rabbi Akiva, it's said about him that he hid from the Roman authorities in a cave, and the Kabbalists imagined that Qabalah and the Zohar was conceived in that cave. Somehow the text had made its way, supposedly, from Galilee to Spain, and now Moisés de Leon was making copies available. So this is the most astounding thing about the Zohar. The book never appeared in Judaism before the 13th century, but the man who published it, you might say, Moisés de Leon, of course this is hundreds of years before printing, the man who made it available, who copied out copies, claimed that he was copying from an ancient manuscript. Now, it turns out most scholars of this field are in agreement that the book was written in the 13th century, that Moisés de Leon himself wrote most of the Zohar. So why did he attribute it to the ancient Rabbi Shimon? Why didn't he come out and say that he was the author of the Zohar? Probably the main reason is so that his radical ideas would be accepted. For example, if Moisés de Leon had come out and said, I have an idea, God is a woman, that might not have gone over so well. But now he was saying that the ancient Rabbi Shimon was teaching us about Shekhinah, the feminine half of God, and her romance with her divine partner, the Holy One, blessed be He. So because people believed that the Zohar went back to this ancient Rabbi Shimon, the Zohar had its effect and its impact. It was that guise of ancient authority that was certainly the main factor in Moisés de Leon's decision to write what's called pseudepigraphically, falsely attributing the book to this ancient figure, Rabbi Shimon, who lived 1,100 years earlier. Now, it may be that Moisés de Leon actually believed that he was in communion with Rabbi Shimon, or that he was somehow channeling the words or the thoughts of Rabbi Shimon. And then there's also probably a more down-to-earth explanation. We know this from a medieval source. It's really a third-hand story, so we can't necessarily accept it as true, but I think it may reflect something of Moisés de Leon's motivation. You see, what happened was a Kabbalist came from the land of Israel to Spain, a man who had grown up in Israel. He came to Moisés de Leon and he said, you claim that you're copying from a book that was written a millennium ago in the land of Israel. I come from the land of Israel. We've never heard of this book. Show me the original. Moisés de Leon said, meet me at my home in a few months and I'll show you the original. But by the time the man came to Moisés de Leon's home, Moisés de Leon had died. So this Kabbalist, who was somewhat skeptical, came to his wife, said to his wife, look, your husband promised me that he would show me the original of the Zohar from which he copied. And his wife replied, I can't show you any such manuscript because my husband, quote, wrote what he did from his own mind. And when I saw him writing, his wife says, according to this third-hand account, when I saw him writing without any material before him, I used to say to him, why do you tell everybody you're copying from a book when you have no book and you're writing from your own head? Wouldn't it be better for you to say that the work was your own creation? Then you'd get more credit. According to this report, her husband de Leon told her, back when he was still alive, quote, if I told them my secret and that what I wrote was my own invention, they wouldn't listen to my words and they wouldn't pay anything for them because they'd say I made it all up. But now when they hear that I'm copying passages for them from the Zohar, written under the influence of the Holy Spirit by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they pay a lot of money for them, as you can see. As you can see. This story may be an invention, but it's likely that financial considerations were also a factor in Moisés de Leon's project. By attributing the work to the ancient Rabbi Shimon, Moisés de Leon convinced many people to accept and respect the Zohar. Within a few decades, few people dared to challenge the authority of the ancient Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, and the Zohar gradually became known as HaZohar HaKadosh, the Holy Zohar, often considered the third holiest book in all of Judaism, after the Bible and the Talmud. In fact, some people claim, Kabbalists claim, that in a sense it's the holiest book, because the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah, so it claims to show the deepest meaning, the mystical meaning of the Bible itself. It's only in relatively recent times that Moisés de Leon's actual role has become clear. He was far more than a scribe. He was the composer of the Zohar, though he certainly drew on earlier medieval material, and he may have collaborated with other Kabbalists in Spain. So here we have a book composed in the 13th century, yet ascribed to ancient sources. Maybe that's why the Zohar calls its teachings Milin Chadatin Atikin in Aramaic, which means new ancient words. These are brand new, but attributed to ancient sources. But in other senses, too, they're new and ancient, and we'll come to that soon. It's really that dialectical relationship with the past, simultaneously new and ancient, that makes the Zohar so intriguing. It's firmly rooted in the Bible and the Midrash, but it thrives constantly on new discovery. We often hear interpretations in the Zohar introduced as follows. This verse has already been discussed, but come and see. This verse has already been established, but come and see. The Zohar celebrates creativity. Maybe Moisés de Leon picked up some of his enthusiasm for that from another Kabbalist, a man named Jacob ben Sheshet, Jacob the son of Sheshet, who says, it's a mitzvah, it's a good deed for every wise person to innovate in Torah according to his capacity. In other words, it's a religious commandment to create new interpretations of Torah. That's really what is behind the Zohar's creativity. After one innovation, that Kabbalist Ben Sheshet says this, in which he brings a certain innovation, and then he says this, don't think that this is far-fetched. If I hadn't invented it in my mind, I would say that it was transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's amazing. In other words, he's aware that he's created it, but he thinks it rings true with the most ancient tradition. And that really shows us something about all of Kabbalah as it begins to emerge in the 13th century. As I've mentioned, most of the Zohar consists of a mystical commentary on the Torah. It penetrates the literal meaning, what's called the pshat, the simple sense of the verse, searching for something beneath the surface, something more profound. As the Zohar puts it, there's not a single word or letter in the Torah that does not contain sublime and precious secrets. The message seems to be, don't be content with the simple meaning of the Bible. Question the text. Questioning becomes a supreme value. Verse by verse, the Zohar surprises and challenges the reader. Every biblical verse is just the starting point, a springboard for the imagination. The Zohar is primarily a biblical commentary, but at the same time it's shaped as a kind of mystical novel. Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues, that ancient Rabbi Shimon who lived 1,100 years earlier, he's the hero of the Zohar, and we hear about Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues wandering through the hills of Galilee, sharing secrets of Torah, running into strange characters on the road. For example, a donkey driver who seems to be like a total idiot, but of course turns out to be a great sage in disguise, or a little child who pokes fun at the rabbis, but ends up amazing them with wisdom. A beggar who enriches them with precious teachings. You could say that the Zohar is a medieval experiment in fiction. Think of Dante and the Divine Comedy. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy about 10 years after the Zohar. Of course, in Italy, not that far from Spain. The Zohar, like Dante, is also journeying through realms of heaven and hell. One of its central themes is the mystery of the eternal feminine, as in Dante, both human and divine. Or think of Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales about a century after the Zohar. And the Zohar is also describing a kind of pilgrimage. Devotees of Torah journeying to discover Shekhinah, the divine presence. As in Chaucer, those travels are enriched by tales. Think finally of Don Quixote, written about 300 years after the Zohar in Spain. The rabbis of the Zohar are also engaged in a fantastic quest to vanquish evil, to mend the world. If Don Quixote is a knight errant, a wandering knight, then the hero of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon, is a saint errant, a holy man wandering in search of wisdom. But the plot of the Zohar focuses ultimately on the inner life of God. And here we come to this diagram, this chart. Take a look just for a moment or two. I don't intend to go through this in any great detail because we'd be here till midnight. But just a few highlights of this so that I can introduce you to a passage or two from the Zohar. These are seen as aspects, you might say, of God's personality. Now, how can you have a depiction of God in a Jewish text? It's really heretical. What saves this from being heretical is that the ultimate reality of God is the white space. And then you could say extending off in all directions, ad ein sof. So the ultimate reality of God, which is ein sof, or infinity, cannot be depicted. What we see here is how ein sof manifests itself, how Ein Sof makes itself accessible to our limited human minds. Several of these sfirot are identified with biblical heroes. Look, for example, a little bit down from the top. We'll get to the top in a minute, but start a little bit down on the right where it says in the circle chesed. The literal meaning is love. That, in other words, this is divine love, which is balanced by its opposite, gevurah, divine power. God's love toward the world, but God's power, or also known as din, God's judgment of the world. The idea here is apparently if God just loved the world, then people would get away with murder. But if God just judged the world, then the world might be condemned to be destroyed every day. So God has to balance love and judgment, love and power. These are seen as reflected in biblical characters. In other words, human biblical heroes represent these divine qualities. Who represents love? It says here Abraham. It's the last word on that list of terms and qualities to the right of the Sfirah Chesed. It says love, also known as Gedulah, grace, white, the color white, water, because it's flowing love. God's right arm, because this whole thing is seen as a human-shaped figure, a divine figure, but shaped in the form of, as it were, a human being. Remember, Ezekiel sees on the throne a figure with the appearance of a human being. So in a sense, the Sfirot are a depiction of what Ezekiel saw on the throne. It's a divine and human figure simultaneously. So this is the divine right arm identified with Abraham. Why Abraham? You may remember stories about Abraham sitting in his tent with the flaps of the tent open, eager to welcome in any strangers, any passers-by. So you could say Abraham lived out that quality of chesed, of divine love. Abraham expressed love so purely in his actions that he attained the quality of chesed. What about Isaac? What was Isaac's primal religious experience, you would say? The Akedah, being bound on the altar, almost being sacrificed by his father, right? Abraham almost kills Isaac in the name of fulfilling the divine command. Supposedly, at the last minute, God says, that's not what I want. But Isaac, you could say Isaac's primal religious experience was almost being killed. So he encountered divine power, divine judgment, this left side of the divine. And he attained that quality. Abraham lived out chesed. Isaac experienced the raw, frightening power of the divine in a harsh judgment. Jacob blends the two of them. So Jacob attains this middle sphira, this middle quality of Tiferet. So that's an example of how the Zohar reads the biblical stories as teaching us about the dynamics of God's inner life. But beyond all of these Sefirot is the infinity of the divine. As I said, the white space, that would be this Ein Sof, there is no end. The goal of the whole system is to unite the male and the female. Male and female appear in various places on this chart, but primarily the middle Sfira Tiferet is seen as masculine, and the last of the 10 Sfirot, Malchut, I'll refer to her as Shekhinah, her other name. Shekhinah means presence, Malchut means kingdom. So Malchut or Shekhinah is the feminine, Tiferet is the masculine. The goal of the system is to unite the masculine and the feminine. But let's move to the top. Have I lost everyone yet? Okay, good. So let's try something a little more difficult. Let's move to the top of the Sfirot. As I said, Ein Sof transcends all of these. Now, what is the first Sfirah? The first Sfirah is called Keter, literally crown. You could say it's a crown on the head. Remember, this is all a divine human figure. Right arm and left arm, masculine and feminine. If it's human, it's an androgynous human being. It's both male and female. But on the head of this figure is Keter, the crown. But its more intriguing name is, it's also called will, but its most intriguing name is Ayin, spelled Aleph, Yud, Nun. That word means what? Nothing. I don't mean that it doesn't mean anything. The word means nothing or nothingness. It's the same as that first word in Ein Sof. Ein Sof means there is not Sof, there is not an end. Ayin is that first word turned into a noun, nothingness. Now, what does it mean to call God nothingness? This does not mean that God doesn't exist. Rather, it conveys the idea that God is no thing. God is, you could say God is the oneness that animates all things. No thingness. We find that idea expressed in Christian mysticism too. Meister Eckhart, a great Christian mystic, immediately after the Zohar, calls God nihil, writing in Latin. Writing in German, he calls God nicht. John of the Cross, writing in Spanish, calls God what? Nada. Nada, nicht, nihil. You have in Jewish and Christian mysticism and in Eastern mysticism a way to speak of God as beyond all being. In other words, God is so real that our normal words for existence don't do justice to God. So rather than call God the ultimate being, the mystics prefer this paradoxical term, no thingness or nothingness. So that's what Ayin represents, the origin of all being, but beyond any notion that we might have of normal being. Out of that ocean of no thingness, out of that primordial pool of pure, undifferentiated energy, there emerges a primordial point known as the next Sfirah, Chokhmah. So Chokhmah, meaning wisdom, divine wisdom is seen as a ray of light or a point of light emerging out of this pool of no thingness. That that point then expands into a circle and becomes the third sphera. Okay, that's all we have to know for now. The pool of nothingness, out of which emerges a ray of light, a point of wisdom, and that point expands into a circle, also pictured as a womb, because Chokhmah is seen as father, and Bina on the left as mother. Here you have the other masculine-feminine pair. Chokhmah and Bina are father and mother. Tiferet and Malchut are, you could say, son and daughter, or husband and wife. So I'm telling you this now because I want to read to you a passage in which the Zohar describes how that point of wisdom emerges out of Keter, out of Ayin, and becomes the palace of Bina. The only other element we need to know is that Chokhmah is called also beginning. Now it's a little strange. Why would Chokhmah be beginning? You should say Keter. The first Sphira is beginning. But Keter is so unknowable, you can't even say this is the beginning. You can't point to it. It's just somehow the hidden source. Chokhmah is given the name Reshit, beginning, based on a verse, and I see some of you nodding your head already, based on a verse in Proverbs, Reshit Chokhmah, the beginning of wisdom. So the Zohar identifies Reshit, beginning, with wisdom. Various Sfirot are given names of God, and Bina happens to be called by the divine name Elohim. Elohim is one of the names of God that appears in the Bible, and that name is assigned to Bina. This is how the Zohar interprets the opening words of Genesis. And for that, we can turn the page and look at the first quote. Those of you who can read Hebrew, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim, which of course we always translate, in the beginning, God created. But what's the actual order of the Hebrew words? Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created, Elohim, God. Because it doesn't say Bereshit Elohim bara, in the beginning God created. The Hebrew actually says Bereshit, in the beginning, bara, created, Elohim, God. Now, of course, in biblical Hebrew, you can have the subject after the verb. It's no problem. So certainly the verse really means, in the beginning God created. But the Zohar says, no, let's read it according to the exact order that the words appear. In the beginning, it created God. That's how the Zohar interprets the opening line of Genesis. Not in the beginning God created, but in the beginning it created God. Now who is it? The unnameable, Ein Sof, or maybe this no thingness. It's really almost impossible to distinguish between Ayin, no thingness, and Ein Sof. So in the beginning, that unnameable, ultimate dimension of God created Elohim. Elohim being what? Which Sphira? Bina. That third Sphira is known as Elohim. I think that that's the Zohar's way of saying what we think of as God isn't the ultimate reality of God. Our notion of God doesn't do justice to the infinite divinity. Okay, I've kind of given you the punchline, but I want to read to you now how the Zohar offers that interpretation. Let me ask you to just put the paper down, put the sheets down. If you feel comfortable, I'll ask you actually to close your eyes. You don't have to, but if you feel comfortable, do so, because I want you now to listen to the Zohar's poetry. Don't try to make sense of every phrase or every image. It's impossible. Just see how the Zohar is kind of trying to describe the indescribable. What the Zohar is describing now is how God's own being begins to unfold from the infinite source. And he'll end up with that interpretation in beginning, or actually with beginning, because the Hebrew letter B can mean in or with. He's reading it with beginning, by means of that Sphira of wisdom, the unnameable one created Elohim, the third Sphira, Bina. Bereshit, in the beginning. At the head of potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed from the head of infinity. A cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a chord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, splaying colors below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. It split and did not split its aura, was not known at all, until under the impact of splitting, a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond that point, nothing is known, so it is called Reshit, beginning, first command of all. The enlightened will shine like the Zohar, the radiance of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Zohar, radiance, concealed of concealed, struck its aura, which touched and did not touch this point. Then this beginning expanded, building itself a palace, worthy of glorious praise. There it sowed seed to give birth, benefiting worlds. Zohar, radiance, sowing seed for its glory, like the seed of fine purple silk, wrapping itself within, weaving itself a palace, constituting its praise, benefiting all. With this beginning, the unknown concealed one created the palace. This palace is called Elohim, God. The secret is Bereshit, bara Elohim. With beginning, created God. That's crystal clear. This is really how the Zohar teaches, without coming out and saying, without even naming the Sfirot, just leaving you kind of swimming or drowning in a sea of imagery, but touching something deep inside and pointing toward something that precedes our normal notion of what God is and who God is. As I said, Ein Sof and Ayin are beyond gender, but I want to focus my remarks now on what I think is maybe the greatest contribution of the Zohar, which is its teaching on Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God, or the feminine half of God. This, in a sense, is revolutionary because so much of Western religion pictures God as male, as masculine. In Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all know that God is dominantly masculine, patriarchal, father, king, ruler, judge. What's new in the Zohar, the most radically new thing in the Zohar, is that God is equally male and female. And the term for the feminine is Shekhinah. So in that chart of the Sfirot, she's the last of the 10, but we can leave the chart aside for now. I want to study with you a few short passages that culminate in a paragraph from the Zohar. So on the second page of the handout. Some terms in Kabbalah or in the Zohar never appear earlier in Jewish sources. For example, Ein Sof. To call God Ein Sof, the infinite, you never find that in the Bible, you never find that in the Talmud. Shekhinah, however, appears very frequently in the Talmud. Never in the Bible. You never have the term Shekhinah in the Bible, but you do have the verb, the root shachan, meaning to dwell. Right? God says, V'asuli mikdash, have them build me a sanctuary, V'shachanti b'tocham, I will dwell among them. So God's dwelling among the people of Israel is central already in the Torah. The rabbis coin this term Shekhinah, referring to God's dwelling in the world. For example, the Midrash of course is rabbinic interpretation of the written Bible, the written Torah. The Midrash asks an interesting question about Moses at the burning bush. God appears to Moses in the burning bush, right? And the bush is burning but not consumed. So the Midrash says, why did God appear to Moses in a bush? Couldn't he have picked something a little more impressive? A sycamore tree, a cypress tree? Why some shrub? The Midrash says, in order to teach you, En makom ba'aretz panui min hashchina. There's no place on earth empty of Shekhinah. God appears in a lowly bush to show you that God is everywhere. That's a typical rabbinic notion of Shekhinah. So Shekhinah is what? You could say omnipresence or immanence, God's immanence in the world. But not only God's immanence in the world, more specifically, look at number 3. I'll read the Hebrew. B'chol makom shegalu, wherever Israel went in exile, Shekhinah imahem. Shekhinah was with them. Okay, if Israel was down in Egypt, enslaved in Egypt, Shekhinah was there. If Israel was in Babylonia, in Babylon, Shekhinah was with them. So Shekhinah is the aspect of God that never abandons the Jewish people. So it's God's presence in the world, but also God's intimacy with Israel. Number 4, Ashrehem HaTzadikim, happy are the righteous, for they cause Shekhinah to dwell on earth. It's very interesting. You could say Shekhinah is on earth, right? Shekhinah fills the earth. That was number 1. Shekhinah is God's immanence throughout the world. But a righteous person, you could say, actualizes the divine potential in the world. By acting in an ethical way, by living a holy life, we can make God real in the world. I think that's the point of this. Happy are the righteous. They cause Shekhinah. They give Shekhinah a place to live on earth because they live a holy life, because they welcome God into their lives. And the final line before we get to the Zohar itself, number 5, this is from the Talmud. Rav Yosef, when Rabbi Yosef heard his mother's footsteps, he would say, I will arise before Shekhinah, who is approaching. So what does that suggest to you? What does it add to Shekhinah? We already know that Shekhinah is God's immanence in the world. Shekhinah is God's intimacy with the Jewish people. But there must be something feminine about Shekhinah. Now, some scholars say, in the Zohar, in the Qabalah, Shekhinah is feminine. But in rabbinic sources, Shekhinah is not feminine. It's just God's presence in the world. But this quote really contradicts that. At least for this one rabbi, his mother was an embodiment of the Shekhinah. His mother somehow, represented the Shekhinah. And I can attest to the truth of that statement. But it's a very significant line because it really shows you that the most radical innovation in all the Zohars, that Shekhinah is the feminine half of God, it's already there in the Talmud. And that you find again and again in Kabbalah. What seem to be the most radical teachings somehow have their root in the Bible or in the Talmud. I'm not saying that there's nothing new or revolutionary about Kabbalah, but it takes hints in the earlier literature and then builds a whole mystical system out of those hints. Okay, we're now ready to look at a passage from the Zohar on the Shekhinah. And as I said, the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah. The Zohar is not a systematic book of mysticism. It's not chapter 1, Ein Sof, chapter 2, the 10 qualities, the 10 Sefirot. Not at all. It just starts from Genesis and moves through the 5 books of Moses. Near the beginning of the Zohar, it's commenting on Genesis chapter 3, the story we all know by heart, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And in this verse, chapter 3, verse 24, it says, just glance at the Hebrew. Even if you don't know Hebrew, I want to show you something about the shape of the Hebrew letters. This verse says, Vayigaresh et ha'adam, which means he drove out Adam. But the Hebrew adds a little word. That middle word is composed of 2 letters. What are those 2 letters? Aleph and Taf. So this is a word in Hebrew that begins with the first letter of the alphabet. Its only other letter is the last letter of the alphabet, so it has the whole alphabet, you could say. It spans Aleph to Taf. And what does it mean? Nothing. So it spans the whole alphabet, but it means nothing. It's very strange. How can you have a word that means nothing? What it really is, a grammarian would tell you, a linguist would tell you, this is a particle. Why do they call it a particle? Because they don't know what to call it, so they call it a particle. But how does it function? The word et basically is a marker for a direct object if that direct object has the definite article. Okay, in Hebrew, you can't say, I drank the water. You have to say, I drank et the water. You can't say, I threw the ball. You have to say, I threw et the ball. It's as if after you say the verb and before you say the object, you say Aleph to Taf. Everything could possibly follow, and then you name a specific thing that follows. I'm not claiming that's the origin of et, but it's intriguing to have a word that is untranslatable and yet encompasses the whole alphabet. Now that kind of word is too good for a rabbi to pass up. Right? And we know in the Talmud already there were rabbis who loved to interpret the word et. If they saw the word et in the verse, they said, this shows something more than the literal meaning of the verse. For example, it says in Deuteronomy, et ha-Elohim tiraun. You should be in awe of God. But it doesn't say you should be in awe of God. It says you should be in awe of et God. What does that et add? Some of you heard me teach this already a few nights ago. What does the et add? Nobody remembers? At least a few of you were there. You're a rabbi. You should be in awe of not only God, the et shows you should also be in awe of your rabbi. Now the et doesn't mean rabbi, it's just that et is there, it's an extra word, it must be adding something to the verse. So Rabbi Akiva, for example, in the Talmud says, et there means you should also be in awe of your rabbi. The principle in Hebrew is et l'rabot. Et adds something to the meaning of the verse. So that we know already in rabbinic literature, that et can add something new. For the Zohar, et becomes specifically a name of Shekhinah. Why is she et? You might say the first of those 10 sefirot, ayin or keter, is symbolized by aleph. Right? It's the beginning, it's the very beginning, so it's the first letter of the alphabet. You might say the last sefirah, Shekhinah, maybe she's taf. But no, she's aleph to taf. Because each of the sefirot includes the preceding sefirot. So Shekhinah includes all the preceding sefirot, so she is known as aleph to taf. So et becomes a code name for Shekhinah. And now we have enough information to read this passage in the Zohar. Okay, what's in italics is from Genesis, and what's in Roman type is from the Zohar. He drove out et ha'adam. Rabbi Elazar said, we do not know who divorced whom. Okay, now why does he say divorce? Because the Hebrew word lagaresh, to drive out, can also mean to divorce. And according to the Midrash, it's as if God and Adam were married. God and Adam were a married couple, as it were, but because Adam disobeyed the command not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, God divorced Adam. That interpretation appears already in a rabbinic text. So the Zohar is playing on that. But the Zohar says what? We don't know who divorced whom. If the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam, did God divorce Adam? Or what's the alternative? Adam divorced God. You're saying that. The Zohar is not going to say that. That's too shocking. What does the Zohar say? Or not? Right? It makes you come up with this radical alternative. Obviously, he wants you to. He's really saying that, but this is typical of the Zohar. It doesn't come out and say what it wants to teach. It makes the reader come up with the inner meaning by himself. We don't know who divorced whom. Did God divorce Adam or not? But the word is transposed. I think he means by this, the whole verse is turned on its head. He drove out et. Notice how he's reading the verse. He's not reading it, he drove out et Adam. He's putting the period after et. He drove out et, meaning he drove out Shekhinah. He divorced Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Then you read the next word, Adam. Okay, this obviously is turning the verse on its head. That's what he says. The word is transposed. The whole verse is turned on its head. He drove out Shekhinah. He divorced Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Then you read the next word, Adam. Adam actually drove out et. Notice he hasn't told us that et means Shekhinah. I had to tell you that. 50 pages later, the Zohar will say et happens to be a code name for Shekhinah. And that's how the Zohar is written, in that cryptic way. It's like a mystery novel. Consequently, it's written, Yud He Vav He Elohim, this double name of God, Yud He Vav He Elohim expelled him from the Garden of Eden. Okay, the Zohar does not deny that God expelled Adam. But he says, why did God expel Adam? Because Adam had already driven out the Shekhinah, as we have explained. Okay, I love that, as we have explained. First of all, he didn't really explain it. Second of all, when did he explain it at all? Like one line earlier. But now it's a tradition, as we have explained. This is the style of the Zohar. So this sounds intriguing, but what does this mean? Adam divorced Shekhinah. It may mean that he should have united the male and female halves of God. He should have meditated on the union of Shekhinah and that central sphira, the masculine sphira. Instead of uniting the two through meditation, through contemplation, or maybe through fulfilling God's command, instead of uniting the two, he split them apart. It might mean that he divorced Shekhinah from her partner. Maybe it means he divorced Shekhinah from himself. He had an intimate relationship with the divine, but now he lost contact with the divine because he failed to fulfill the first command. Or maybe it has a psychological meaning that Adam and Eve became aware that they were separate. Right? It says they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They realized they were naked. So they realized something about their individual personalities. They became separate egos. They each became a separate individual. Until then, they were just somehow part of creation, part of some stream of undifferentiated existence. Now they became aware we exist separately. It's really what happens to each of us as we grow up, right? Every baby, until a certain point, a baby thinks it's one with the mother, or it's one with the world. And then sometime in the second year, the baby starts to figure out that it's a separate individual. So Adam and Eve are going through that same individuation, that same discovery of separateness. Maybe in that sense, he became divorced from the divine oneness. The Zohar doesn't explain what it means, but the main thing it's doing is turning the verse on its head. This is in a sense, the counterpart to, in the beginning, God created. Right there, the Zohar took the subject, God, and made it into the object. In the beginning, it created God. Here, it takes the object. He drove out Adam, and it makes the object the subject. Adam is really the one who drove out, who expelled. So the Zohar loves to turn the verses on its head. Now, the author of the Zohar knows that that's not the simple meaning of the verse. But he wants to convey some theological point. I said a few minutes ago, or 15 minutes ago, that the Zohar calls its teachings new, ancient words, right? That really applies very much to this idea of Shekhinah. Why do I say that? Because in one sense, the idea of God being half male and half female is brand new, right? You don't find that in a Jewish text before the Kabbalah. No Jewish text that I'm familiar with says God is equally male and female until the Kabbalah. It's very hard to find feminine descriptions of God. You can find a phrase here, an image there in the book of Jeremiah, or half a line, but never is there talk about the union of the male and female within God. So this is certainly a new idea. But on the other hand, it's very ancient. Why do I say that? If you go back not to the Bible, but to what's happening in Canaan, to what you might say to what the Bible is fighting against, what are the prophets condemning the people for? Worshipping the false gods and goddesses of Canaan. So there is a goddess in the ancient Near East, just that the Bible is fighting against it. The Bible is trying to eliminate, to eradicate the whole idea of the goddess. And you might say, in some sense, what happens in the Zohar is that idea of the goddess somehow re-emerges now within Judaism. Right in the heart of medieval Judaism, you have that divine feminine, which had been rejected entirely by the biblical authors, now re-emerging. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, he calls this the revenge of myth. The revenge of myth, as if, the Bible had tried to eliminate this, to extirpate the goddess, to eradicate the goddess, but somehow picturing God as feminine could not be totally eliminated. There's some deep yearning in the human soul, in the Jewish soul and the human soul, to picture God not just as the disciplinarian, not just as the strict father, but as the loving mother, as the compassionate mother. So that idea of the feminine goddess somehow now resurfaces in the guise of Shekhinah. You really could say, to risk being a little too pop, that Shekhinah is the goddess become kosher. The goddess has now become kosher under the name of Shekhinah. So in that sense, it's both new and ancient. It's a brand new radical idea, but it's recovering some ancient stratum, some ancient layer that just could not be completely defeated. In fact, more remarkable than that is we know that in ancient Israel, not only were there Israelites who worshiped the goddess, there were some Israelites who wanted to combine the worship of the goddess with the worship of the God of Israel. How do we know that? We know that archaeologists have found inscriptions. For example, there's an inscription just about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, which says, this is in honor of Yud-He-Vav-He, right, the God of Israel, and his Asherah, his Canaanite goddess named Asherah. So there were Israelites trying to combine the worship of the one true God with his wife, with his counterpart, Asherah. And in the Zohar, that becomes the union of the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shekhinah. I don't want to give you too much Zohar at once because I want you to fall in love with it. So let's just close with a parable from the Zohar, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. On the last sheet of the handout, last page. This is a parable that appears in the middle of the Zohar. It's about how to study the Bible, how to study Torah. There was a man who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those living in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. Okay, he's a health food nut. He just wants pure wheat berries. That's enough for him. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What's this for?" They replied, "It's bread to eat." He ate and it tasted very good. He asked, "What's it made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. He tasted them and asked, "And what are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." Later they offered him royal pastry kneaded with honey and oil. He asked, "What are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." He said, "Surely I am the master of all of these, since I eat the essence of all of these, wheat." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost to him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights, diverging from that principle. Let me ask one of you, what's going on here with this mountain man? What strikes you about the story? There's not one message here necessarily, not one correct formulation, but someone start us off. Please. The what? The elephant and the blind man. Yeah. Right. He knows one element, he knows a part of it, and he thinks that's all there is. So whatever they introduce him to, he reduces it to the one thing he knows. Now, the only difference is that with the elephant, each of those parts, the tusk and the legs and the tail and whatever, those are all parts of the elephant. There's not one part which is like the whole elephant. But here, he does have, there's no doubting that he does have what? The kernel. He has the essence. He does have the essence, but he reduces everything to the essence. It's like the elephant, but just a little more so. So that he reduces everything to the essence. He's trapped in the literal. If this is about Torah, it's probably about Torah. He's a fundamentalist. This is really a 13th century attack on fundamentalism. Saying this guy maybe he knows the Bible by heart. He's fixated on the literal sense. He can't appreciate how it could expand in meaning. Now when they show him the bread, actually he likes it. He eats the bread. That's probably midrash. That's probably the literal sense being expanded by the rabbis into Talmud and Midrash. And that he likes, he appreciates it. But then he asks his question, what's it made of? Then they give him the next layer of meaning, the cakes. That's probably philosophy. The thick loaves, that's probably philosophy. There he's more hesitant. Notice it doesn't say he ate, but rather he tasted. Takes a taste, he asks his analytical question. Then they give him the ultimate delight, the baklava, which stands for Qabalah. Right? See, some things you lose in translation, but then there are new possibilities that rise. So the ultimate is probably Qabalah. What happens this time? He doesn't even taste. Just asks his question. They say wheat. He says, I know wheat. So he doesn't need to even get to the ultimate he feels because he has the essence. Please, Saul. Exactly. This guy, that's what the Zohar says, that at the end, he has the principle, he has the essence, he doesn't know how to apply it in life. This makes it a very Jewish mysticism. Because usually in mysticism, the goal is what? To get to the essence. Go off to the mountain, go off to the cave, meditate on the meaning of life. If you have the essence, that's all you need. The Zohar says, no, he missed the whole boat. Because he doesn't know how to live it out, how to apply it, how to live it out in community. You're right. You're right. It's not just the criticism of him. You could say this isn't only about how not to read, it's also about how not to teach. They're a total failure. They should say wheat, and this is what you do to it. Wheat, and this is what you add to it. So both of them are missing something.
I would say he doesn't appreciate the potentiality in
Yes.
each of us that can emerge out of the nothingness.
Yes. If it's about mysticism, then maybe it's also a critique of mysticism, of mystics who are so fixated on divine nothingness or on the origin of it all, they forget, how to live in the world. It's also anti-ascetic, right? Not Hasidic, but ascetic. We were talking about this before. Usually in mysticism, you try not to indulge in in fancy things or fattening food. This guy, he's very noble. He just wants to have the most simple thing possible. But for the Zohar, he misses the boat because he can't appreciate everything that could emerge in the world. Pam.
I was going to say essence. I don't think he has the essence. Rather than use that word,
Yeah.
he has a very reductionist.
Mm-hmm.
Because the essence is really what it's all about, to be able to traverse
Right.
those worlds, the four worlds. But
Yeah.
he stays in a very
Yeah.
one-dimensional or two-dimensional, very simple,
Right.
understanding him and his weak.
Right.
And I think that the end of it really bemoans the fact that he has not been able to access the power of his imagination
Right.
to bring him into
Good.
the whole
It's really,
experience. It is the essence, really.
it's really his poverty of imagination. You could say he has the essence, but he doesn't know how to apply it, or you could say he misses the essence. You could, right.
Basic building blocks.
Right.
But that's not what
You could also say he has the essence, but the point here is S. Okay. Yeah. Please, David.
This might be an allegory of the acronym of Pardes. So you got the wheat could be the pshat,
Yes.
and he has three other scenarios, which would be the remnants.
Right. Okay. You're getting us into more detail, but since you mentioned it, it's certainly what he has in mind here. According to Kabbalah, there are 4 levels of meaning. Okay, the literal is called pshat, the simple. So that's pei or p. Then the next one is remez, a hint, resh. Then drash or midrash, a dalid, and finally sod with a samach. So it's P-R-D-S, pardes, pei resh dalid samach. Pardes meaning a garden, an orchard. That word then later becomes paradise in Greek. But in Hebrew it means an orchard. So the orchard of Kabbalah, the whole riches of Kabbalah of Torah, demand that you be open to all these levels. Now it's interesting, you say pardes, but the progression is really pshat and then what? Midrash or drash. So it should be PD, then comes remez, hint, then the philosophy, then comes sod. So it should be PDRS, which spells what? Padres. That fits Spain better even than Pardes. But the acronym they use is pardes. Please.
I have a question. It seems to me that the bottom line of mysticism is still clarity, otherwise we may confuse.
The bottom line of mysticism is what?
Clarity.
Clarity? Clarity. Yeah. And how does that relate to this, or not necessarily?
I'm sorry.
How does it relate to the mountain man? Oh, separate. Yeah, I mean, you could say to see through the surface layer, not to be fooled by the outer coating of reality or the outer layer of meaning in the Bible. It's trying to penetrate more deeply, to see through, so the text becomes transparent and something emerges that you hadn't seen before. Definitely, that's the progression that's how Kabbalah reads the Torah. Yeah. And Zohar, meaning radiance. All the books are about light, about vision, about something shining through. Please.
I look at it like the raw, the essence of the wheat is almost like just the words themselves. The words are still
Yes. The words that you find in the text, in the Bible.
and
Right.
They needed them, so they put some effort in it with oil to create it into like a taste of delight. So maybe that's like the spiritual work involved in
Yeah.
the truth and taking it further and contemplating it.
Definitely.
The oil and how do you represent, but I'm sure it's probably
Yeah, just further unfolding of all those potential meanings. That's really it. This is such a beautiful parable. I don't want to beat it to death. Maybe one more thought, then I'll be happy to take a couple general questions about Kabbalah. And then, yeah. Maybe if you could stand up.
I feel that when he sees from far away the temple, it doesn't, and he only appreciates the aesthetics of it from far away without actually having to go to the courtyard and to the center and then the Holy of Holies. And he just is satisfied with it, seeing it from far away.
Seeing it from afar. That's certainly finally with the ultimate delight. He never touches it. He never tastes it. He just asks his question. Once they say wheat, he doesn't need it, he thinks. I almost think that the Zohar inherited a parable where this guy was the hero, where all you need is the essence, all you need is the wheat. Maybe, he has all that he needs, but the Zohar turns it on its head. The Zohar says, no, he really missed the whole boat. It's hard to know. Any questions just generally about Kabbalah
I was
or Zohar?
very intrigued by your description of Zohar being embodying an integration of the male and female elements of God, in stark contrast to the biblical tradition.
Right.
My understanding of the Bible and the times is that this was the period in which patriarchy was being established, and that went hand in hand with kingships arising among the Israelites. And so the getting rid of the goddess was important in that domain.
Right.
So what was going on in 13th century Spain? We know what happened 2 centuries later, but what was going on in 13th century Spain for the Jews living there that would have provoked the opposite, the integration of man.
What stimulates the emergence of the feminine in describing God in 13th century Spain? Certainly, one element is, probably you have this in mind in asking the question, is Mary. The image of Mary in the church. Right? The Christians are talking. You weren't thinking about her. Okay, well, but certainly, these are Jews writing it, but they're living in Christian Spain. It's a perfect example of how things don't happen in a vacuum. So the author of the Zohar, in fact, Moisés de Leon, why is he called Moisés de Leon? Because he came from Leon. This is not Lyon in France, but Leon in northwestern Spain. As he was growing up, there was a church built, a huge church built in honor of Mary. Probably the first church, certainly the first church in his city, because it was only in the 13th century, this is what's important, it was only in the 13th century that the church officially recognized the divine status of Mary. It was, I would say, the semi-divine status of Mary. Right? Mary was worshipped by common Christians for hundreds of years earlier. But the church itself never recognized that Mary was divine or partly divine until the 13th century. And then churches were built in her honor. You could say literally Moisés de Leon grew up in the shadow of Mary. Now, is it any accident that in the Zohar all of a sudden you have the divine feminine? The Christians are worshiping the feminine and the Jews are worshiping the feminine. Dante is writing about the eternal feminine 10 years later. So that, I'm not saying that the Shekhinah, wouldn't have emerged without that. Shekhinah exists in the Talmud. And we already saw that in the Talmud there was one rabbi who thought that his mother was the embodiment of Shekhinah. So we don't need Mary to make Shekhinah feminine. But I think the fact that Christians are fascinated by Mary and worshiping Mary stimulated the Kabbalists to write as much as they did about Shekhinah.
What, if any, political implications were there that would contrast with the...
Politically, I mean, you don't have anyone challenging patriarchy, right? In Christian Spain, the king is still the king. There's a great king at the time. The king at the time also stimulated Qabalah because he was interested in all world wisdom. The king of the time was really a Renaissance figure. Usually we think of Renaissance as Italy, 15th century. But there's a Renaissance in Spain in the 13th century. There's a Renaissance in Italy in the 12th century. In Spain, the king was known as Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso el Sabio, Alfonso X. He had a project to collect all of the world's wisdom. How did he do that? He hired Jews and Arabs to translate works of philosophy from Arabic into Latin and from Arabic into Castilian, into Spanish. There was no Spanish literature at all until the 13th century. I mean, hardly any. There are a couple compositions. There's no extensive Spanish literature until Alfonso X created it by having Jews and Muslims translate works of wisdom, of Greek philosophy, from Arabic, right, which had originally been Greek to Arabic to Latin, or Greek to Arabic to Castilian. There are Jews who are translating that, along with Muslims, and he's creating a whole library of the wisdom of the world. He also was interested in Kabbalah. Alfonso X had an interest in Kabbalah, and maybe Moisés de Leon convinced him that the Zohar was ancient, that it really went back to the 2nd century, and that it was worth his while to also support him. We don't know that, but there was some connections between Moisés de Leon and the crown and the Spanish royalty. So it's not that the women are becoming empowered. I would say this, that it took 700 years from saying God is feminine to saying women are equal. Okay, that took only 700 years. That took 700 years, but it was a great breakthrough to say it in terms of the divine, because as you said, kings were empowered, male kings were empowered, because they claimed they were the model, they were modeled on the divine king. Here you have a divine queen. It takes, there are queens, human queens, but it takes a long time for women to become enfranchised. But this is part of feminism. In a sense, it's recovering I mentioned the exile of the Shekhinah, right? Wherever Israel goes into exile, Shekhinah is with them. You could also understand it as the exile of the feminine. The feminine was exiled. Okay, the goddess was eliminated. The women were disenfranchised, or women were, turned into secondary humans, as it were. And that was an exile of the feminine. And then the emergence of the feminine is partly, aided by this theological transformation, insisting that God is male and female. Please.
People to come to the microphone, please.
Talking to the microphone? Have people talking to the microphone. Okay. It's a good idea. Why don't you, or just speak loudly if you can. If you could stand up, because some people can't hear you. Is Shekhinah a feminine? I'll repeat the question. Is Shekhinah a feminine word? Shekhinah as a noun is feminine. Right, so that's important. Right, because every noun in Hebrew is either masculine or feminine. So the fact that the rabbis use the word Shekhinah, there's something feminine about Shekhinah right from the start. But the thing is, it's very hard to find an overt description in the Talmud, in the Midrash, of Shekhinah as feminine. Other than this one line about Rav Yosef identifying his mother as an embodiment of Shekhinah, It's very hard to see. But you just hear about Shekhinah hovering or Shekhinah protecting. So there's something motherly about that. Maybe one or two more questions, and then I'll be happy to continue individually with people. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Could you please explain the relationship between Sefer Yetzirah and Zohar, and even if you just like a nugget on Tikkun Zohar?
Yeah, I don't want to get too technical. We can talk more about that later. But in one sentence, Sefer Yetzirah is an early, you might say, proto-Kabbalistic, pre-Kabbalistic text, probably written around the 2nd century. So this is the time of Rabbi Shimon. This is 1,000 years before Kabbalah emerges, the book of formation or the book of creation. Tikkun Zohar we can talk about afterward. Yes?
Question for you. To what extent has your great understanding of Zohar influenced your reading and understanding of the Torah?
To what extent has my study of Zohar deepened my understanding of Torah? Next question. No, I'd say it makes me look. It makes me question the text. Sometimes the Zohar's questions are better than its answers. But the wonderful things the Zohar says, but it's especially the boldness of its interpretation that I find, particularly exciting. Last question, please. I can't hear. Please stand. Different versions of Kabbalah, right? Yes.
What just followed, and did they disagree?
How does it develop, and
Yeah, which one followed?
is there one authentic Kabbalah? I would say that there is no such thing as the authentic Kabbalah. Kabbalah just keeps emerging and growing. I'm particularly interested in the Zohar itself, and not what Isaac Luria does to it. Isaac Luria, the next great creative figure after the Zohar, he was in the 16th, Zohar is 13th century, Isaac Luria was in the 16th century in Safed and Sfat, and he takes the Zohar and does his own thing with it. But my interest is really what the Zohar says itself. It's such beautiful poetry and such beautiful imagery, I don't really want to fit it in that Lurianic box. All of Kabbalah eventually became Lurianic Kabbalah because he was so dominant. But my preference is to go back to what a teacher of mine called Pshat HaZohar, the simple sense of the Zohar. Why don't we stop there? I'll be happy to sign some books and to talk to people. Thank you. Good job.